daughter-in-law told my son that I smelled like a bus station. She didn't say it to my face. She never did anything to my face. That was her way. Always just out of earshot. Always just loud enough that it could have been a misunderstanding if I ever brought it up. But my son heard it, and when he told me 2 days later, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, I could see it cost him something just to say the words out loud. I told him not to worry about it. That's what I always said. But I want to tell you something about that smell she was referring to. I drove a city bus in Memphis, Tennessee for 31 years. 31 years of early mornings and late nights, of summer heat baking through the windshield, of diesel and vinyl, and the particular mix of people who ride public transit before 6 in the morning, nurses going to their shifts, janitors coming off theirs, kids trying to get to school on time when their mamas didn't have a car. I knew those routes the way some men know a golf course. Every pothole, every light that ran a half-second short, every stop where someone was always going to be running. When I retired, my union threw me a little party. They gave me a plaque. My supervisor, a man who never once complimented anyone on anything in 30 years, shook my hand and said I was the most reliable driver he'd ever had. I drove that same Route 14 for 19 of those 31 years without a single incident report. My wife Lorraine, God rest her, used to say I smelled like the city when I came home. She meant it as a compliment. She'd press her face against my shoulder and breathe in and say, "You smell like you've been somewhere." She meant that I'd been out in the world doing something real, something that mattered to people. Lorraine passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I sold the house we'd raised our boy in and moved into a smaller place over in Midtown. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a little backyard, a porch I sit on in the evenings. My boy, Wendell, was grown by then, already living across town with a good job doing IT work for a logistics company. We had Sunday dinners together most weeks. We talked on the phone. We were close the way fathers and sons get close again, once the son stops being a young fool and starts becoming a man. Then he met Serena. I want to be fair here, because I've had 8 years to think about this, and I don't want to be the kind of old man who just badmouths his son's wife without understanding the whole picture. Serena is not a bad person. I don't think she's mean at heart, but she came from a family with very different ideas about what counted as respectable and what didn't. Her father is a periodontist in Germantown. Her mother does something with non-profit boards, attends lunches, organizes galas, sits on committees. They live in a house with a circular driveway and a kitchen that was featured in a local magazine one time. I know because Serena mentioned it more than once. When Wendell brought her to meet me for the first time, I made a pot roast and bought good bread from the bakery down the street. I wore a clean shirt. I thought it went well. Serena smiled and said nice things about the neighborhood and asked me polite questions about my career, but there was something in her eyes when I talked about the bus, a kind of careful neutrality, the face people make when they're deciding not to react to something. I noticed. I'm 63 years old. I notice things. They got engaged a year later. The wedding was at a vineyard outside the city, about 45 minutes from Memphis, one of those restored plantation-style properties that had been turned into an event venue. It was a beautiful day. I wore the suit I'd bought for Lorraine's sister's funeral, which was the last formal occasion I'd had, and I sat in the front row and cried a little when Wendell said his vows because that's what fathers do, and I'm not ashamed of it. After the wedding, things shifted slowly. The Sunday dinners got less regular. Wendell started calling less. When I did see him, Serena was usually there, and there was always a faint sense of things being managed, topics being steered, evenings being kept to a schedule. I told myself it was just marriage. That's how it goes. Sons get absorbed into their wives' lives. It's natural. I didn't want to be the kind of father who made his son feel guilty for being happy. But then Easter happened. They had a big Easter brunch at their house. It was the first holiday gathering at their new place in East Memphis. Nice neighborhood, nice house, 3 bedrooms and a finished basement and a yard with a fire pit. Wendell had worked hard for it, and I was proud of him. Serena's family came down from Germantown. Her parents, her two sisters, her brother-in-law who managed a chain of urgent care clinics, her aunt who'd been on a local news station for 20 years. I drove over with a pound cake I'd made myself. Lorraine's recipe, the one with the lemon glaze that Wendell had loved since he was 7 years old. I got there a little early because that's my habit. When I knocked, it was Serena who answered. She looked surprised and then smoothed that surprise into a smile very quickly. She said Wendell was in the backyard setting up chairs. She took the pound cake from me without looking at it and set it on the kitchen counter in a way that made me understand it was not going to be served. I went to find my son. The brunch itself was fine. The food was catered. Little quiches and a smoked salmon display and those small croissants that are more air than bread. I sat next to Wendell and we talked quietly, and I tried not to let it bother me that I didn't know anyone, and no one seemed particularly interested in knowing me. Serena's father talked loudly about a golf trip to Scottsdale. Her brother-in-law talked about the urgent care expansion. I ate my small croissants and thought about Lorraine. On the drive home, I passed a trash can on the curb and thought about the pound cake, and I decided to let it go. I let a lot of things go over the next year. I let go of the time Serena talked over me at Thanksgiving when I was in the middle of a sentence. I let go of Christmas when they spent 4 days with her family in Germantown and called me on the 26th for 40 minutes. I let go of the small things. The way she corrected my grammar once in front of her mother, the way she sometimes looked at my car when I pulled into their driveway, a 2009 Buick that ran fine and had never given me a moment's trouble. I let things go because Wendell was happy, and Wendell's happiness mattered more to me than my pride. But then I heard what she said. It was February. Wendell's birthday was coming up, and I'd called to ask what he wanted to do. I always took him to dinner on his birthday, just the two of us, a tradition we'd kept since Lorraine died. He seemed distracted on the phone, a little uncomfortable. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes. I let it go. A week later he came by my house alone on a Wednesday evening without calling first. That almost never happened. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said that a few days before he'd overheard Serena on the phone with her mother. He hadn't meant to listen. He'd just come into the hallway at the wrong moment. She was talking about his birthday dinner. She was telling her mother that she'd suggested they all go together, her family and me, to a nice restaurant downtown. She said she'd tried. She said she'd even picked the restaurant, one of those upscale southern places where the entrees run $40 and everyone dresses up. And then she said, "But I just can't spend 3 hours sitting across a table from a man who smells like a bus station. My parents would be mortified." Wendell stopped talking. He was looking at his hands. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked out the window at the streetlight, coming on in the early dark. I thought about 31 years of 5 a.m. alarms. I thought about Lorraine saying I smelled like somewhere real. I thought about the pound cake on the kitchen counter that was never served. I said, "She's not wrong that I've spent a lot of time around buses." Wendell looked up. "Dad, how do you feel about a birthday dinner?" I said. "Just the two of us, somewhere we actually want to go." He exhaled. "Yeah," he said, "I'd really like that." We went to a barbecue place on Summer Avenue that we'd been going to since Wendell was in middle school. The kind of place with picnic tables and paper towels on a roll instead of napkins, and pulled pork that is genuinely among the finest things I've ever eaten. We split a rack of ribs and talked for 2.5 hours about his job, about a fishing trip we kept saying we were going to take and never did, about Lorraine, about a funny thing that had happened to me on Route 14 back in 2003 that I'd told him before but that he always liked to hear again. It was the best birthday dinner we'd had in years. But I won't pretend that's where the story ends, because it isn't. 3 weeks after that dinner, Serena's younger sister announced her engagement. The wedding was set for October, a Saturday, at a hotel ballroom in downtown Memphis. Big event, 200 guests, rehearsal dinner the night before, brunch the morning after. Wendell was asked to be a groomsman. He was happy about it. I was happy for him. Then Wendell called me on a Thursday night, about 6 weeks before the wedding. He said Serena had been going back and forth about the guest list. There had been cuts. Her parents were paying for most of it, and they'd asked to keep the numbers down. He said that in the process of trimming the list, my invitation had been, and he paused here, choosing his word carefully, reconsidered. I said, she took me off the guest list. He didn't say anything. I said, for her sister's wedding. Dad, I tried. I know you did. Her parents said the venue had a hard cap on numbers, and they went through the list and… Wendell. I said his name the way I used to when he was a boy, and I needed him to stop and listen. It's all right. It was not all right. But I meant that I wasn't going to make it his problem, that I wasn't going to put him in the middle of something he hadn't created and couldn't solve. I told him to have a wonderful time and that I wanted to hear all about it and that I'd see him soon. After I hung up, I sat on my porch for a long time. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something older and quieter than anger. It was the feeling of having been weighed and found unworthy, of having the entirety of yourself, your work, your life, your 31 years and your pound cake and your suit from a funeral, measured against a ballroom in downtown Memphis and come up short. I called my old friend Augustin. We'd driven buses together for 15 years, overlapping shifts for a long time before he moved to the garage side doing maintenance. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So what are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Well, you've got 6 weeks to figure it out." I thought about it for most of those 6 weeks. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't confront Serena. I didn't call her parents. I went about my life. I volunteered 2 mornings a week at a transportation program for seniors that I'd been part of since I retired, driving folks to medical appointments and grocery stores in a van that ran on the same principle as everything I'd ever done, getting people where they needed to go. I watched my shows. I talked to Wendell, who seemed to be trying hard to act normal and not quite managing it. And I thought about what I actually wanted. Not revenge, not drama, not to blow up my son's marriage or make his in-laws feel small. What I wanted was simpler than any of that. I wanted my son to know what I was worth. The wedding weekend arrived. Wendell texted me Friday evening to say the rehearsal dinner had gone well, that he was thinking of me. I texted back that I was proud of him and hoped the whole weekend was wonderful. Saturday morning, the day of the wedding, I woke up at 5:30, the way I always do. I made coffee. I sat on my porch and watched the neighborhood come to life. And then I did something I had been planning quietly for 3 weeks. I drove to the hotel. Not to the wedding. I wasn't there to cause a scene, and I wasn't uninvited to the wedding, and I want to be clear about that. What I was invited to, what I had been specifically and genuinely invited to 2 weeks earlier, was a small gathering happening that same morning in a conference room on the 2nd floor of that same hotel. The Memphis Regional Transit Authority was holding its annual retiree recognition breakfast. I'd been on their mailing list for years, and gone most years, but this year they'd asked me specifically to say a few words. I'd been named to a small honor they gave out occasionally, something called the Distinguished Service Recognition. For 31 years of safe operation and perfect attendance for 19 of them, I'd sent a letter. I'd called to confirm. I'd almost declined because, in all honesty, those kinds of things make me a little uncomfortable. But I said yes, because of the timing, because sometimes the world hands you a moment and you either take it or you don't. I wore my good suit. Not the funeral suit. I bought a new one, a navy one, from a department store in Eastgate. I got it tailored properly. I shined my shoes. I looked in the mirror that morning and I thought, I look like a man who has been somewhere and done something. I walked into that hotel and I took the elevator to the 2nd floor and I sat at a table with 17 other retired transit workers and we ate eggs and biscuits and drank coffee and told stories. The director of the Transit Authority gave a short speech. He said that the work of public transit was the work of a city's circulatory system, that without the people who showed up every day at hours no one else wanted to work, in vehicles that carried hundreds of thousands of trips a year, nothing else in a city could function. He said that the men and women in that room had made Memphis move. When they called my name, I stood up. I said a few words. I talked about Lorraine, how she used to pack my lunch before my early shifts and leave a note in the bag that I'd find when I opened it on my break. I talked about the riders on Route 14, the regulars whose names I knew, whose lives I'd watched change over 19 years. I said that I'd been told once, indirectly, that my work left a smell on me that made me unfit for certain rooms. I paused there and looked around at those 17 people. I said that the smell of work was the smell of a life that meant something, that I had carried more people to more places that mattered, hospitals and job interviews and first days of school, than I could ever count, and that no ballroom and no guest list had ever meant more than any one of those trips. People clapped. My friend Augustin was there and he stood up, and then a few others stood up, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep myself together. Afterward, in the lobby, I ran into Serena. I genuinely had not planned this. The wedding was on a different floor, in the main ballroom, and I was heading to the parking garage when the elevator opened, and there she was in a peach-colored bridesmaid dress, alone for a moment, looking at her phone. She looked up. She saw me in my navy suit with the little recognition pin on the lapel. She took in the whole picture. She said, "You look nice." I said, "Thank you. Your sister's wedding is today. I hope it's beautiful." She said, "What are you? Why are you here?" I told her about the breakfast, about the recognition. I told her what the director had said, about the circulatory system of a city. I kept my voice even, and I didn't say a single thing that was unkind, because I had not come there to be unkind. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you'd received that." I said, "There's a lot you don't know about me." I said it gently, not as a cut, as a simple fact. She looked at her phone and then back at me, and something moved across her face that I can only describe as recalculation, like a person who has been working from a map and suddenly understands they had the wrong scale. I said, "Have a wonderful celebration," and I walked to the parking garage and drove home. That evening, Wendell called me. He said the wedding had been beautiful, that he'd danced until his feet hurt, that he'd been thinking about me all day. Then he got quiet and said, "Serena told me she saw you." I said, "She did." "Dad," she cried a little. "In the bridal suite, before the ceremony. She didn't tell me why until tonight." I didn't say anything. "She said she'd been wrong about you, that she'd been wrong about a lot of things." He paused. "She wants to know if she can call you this week." I said yes, not because everything was fixed and not because I'd forgotten anything, but because my son loved this woman, and if she was willing to start again from a truer place, then so was I. That's not weakness. That's what Lorraine would have called being the bigger vessel, having enough room inside yourself to hold more than just your own wound. Serena called on Tuesday. We talked for almost an hour. She told me about her own father, how he'd built his practice from almost nothing, how his whole idea of security was built around what you could show on the outside, the right neighborhood, the right school, the right restaurant. She said she'd absorbed that without ever questioning it. She said she was sorry. She said it clearly and without qualification and without asking for anything in return. I said, "I know your father worked hard, and I know you love him. The way we love our parents and the things we take from them without meaning to. I understand that better than most people." We agreed to try. Not a performance of trying, real trying, the kind where you have an awkward dinner and then a slightly better one, and then one where you almost forget to be careful. The fishing trip that Wendell and I had been talking about for years, we finally booked it. 3 days in the cabin outside Pickwick Lake, late September. Just the two of us. The morning of the first day, we were out on the water before the sun was fully up, and Wendell said, "I'm sorry it took this long, Dad. For all of it." I told him he didn't need to apologize. He said, "I know, I want to." We sat with that for a while. The water was calm and the light was coming sideways through the trees, and somewhere across the lake a heron moved through the air like it had all the time in the world. I thought about Route 14, about the woman who rode the 547 every morning for 12 years and always said good morning with the same warmth whether I was running on time or 20 minutes late, about the teenage boy who thanked me once, sincerely, after I'd waited 30 extra seconds for him to run up the block, a small mercy that had cost me nothing. About Lorraine's note in my lunchbox, folded in half, written in her looping handwriting. You are the kind of man who shows up. Never stop. I never did. The way you treat the people who kept this city running, the drivers and the janitors and the mechanics and all the rest, that says everything about who you are underneath the suit, underneath the address, underneath the restaurant you can afford. And the way a man treats his father, that's not just a family matter, that's character. That's the whole thing right there. I'm 63 years old. I drove a bus for 31 years. I raised a good son. And I still smell like somewhere real. That's enough. That has always been enough. I've been thinking about that morning in the hotel lobby a lot lately. The way Serena looked at me. Not with contempt, not with the polished neutrality I'd seen at Easter brunch, but with something closer to genuine surprise. Like she'd been handed a map she hadn't known existed and was only now realizing how wrong her previous directions had been. That's what happens when you let a person's whole life speak for itself. You don't have to argue. You don't have to explain. You just have to keep showing up, doing the work, being who you are, and eventually the truth fills the room on its own. I think about cause and effect a lot, not in any mystical sense, just in the plain, observable way that life tends to balance its own ledger. Serena dismissed me because of what I smelled like, what I drove, what table I came from, and that dismissal shaped the way she saw every interaction we'd ever had. But the thing about that kind of judgment is that it only holds as long as the other person stays invisible. The moment I walked into that hotel in a navy suit with a recognition pin from the Memphis Regional Transit Authority, the moment she had to reckon with 31 years of service and a room full of people who stood up for me, the ledger started correcting itself. Not because I forced it to, because I had simply lived honestly long enough that the truth had weight. That's what I'd call integrity, though I never use that word much out loud because it sounds like something people say in speeches. What I mean is just this: doing what you're supposed to do for the right reasons, even when nobody's watching and nobody's applauding and nobody's putting you on any guest list. I drove Route 14 for 19 years with perfect attendance, not because I wanted a plaque. I drove it because people were counting on me to be there. That's the whole of it. And I think about Wendell too, about what it must have cost him to come to my kitchen table that Wednesday night and tell me what he'd heard. He didn't have to do that. He could have kept it from me, managed things quietly, kept the peace. But he chose honesty over comfort, and that choice, that small hard choice, is what made it possible for us to actually fix something instead of just covering it up. Intelligence isn't only about being clever. It's about knowing what a situation really is, not just what it looks like on the surface. Wendell saw clearly. That matters. And then there is the long, quiet kind of endurance that nobody talks about enough. The ability to keep going, not just to endure, but to keep going with your dignity intact and your heart still open. I let a lot of things go over those years. Not because I was weak, because I understood that absorbing a wound without retaliating is its own form of strength. The fishing trip finally happened. The phone calls got easier. Serena and I talked for an hour on a Tuesday afternoon, and something real started between us. None of that would have been possible if I'd blown everything apart the moment I felt wronged. Lorraine used to say, "You are the kind of man who shows up." I always thought she meant it literally. The early alarms, the roots, the reliability, but I understand it differently now. Showing up means being present in your own life with your whole self, not shrinking to fit someone else's idea of who you're supposed to be. I'm 63 years old, and I still smell like somewhere real. I always will.